When the superclass mantis fell, all the other mantises that were left on the field scrambled and scurried away. Uncaring for the stragglers, Han Sen returned to the courtyard to examine the blood egg tree. Han Sen was not sure if the fruits it bore had matured yet, but he knew whatever he could harvest was different than what he'd usually get. He believed the fist-sized fruit would produce creatures and weren't for proper eating. Han Sen picked one off a branch and crushed it. This was what he had done to the dragon blood fruit, and that was how he received the dragon blood snakes. The same protocol most likely applied, though he wasn't sure what manner of beast souls he might get off this tree. The blood eggs looked like real eggs, and when he crushed the shell, a red light shone. The red light formed the image of a monkey with wings, and after the brief apparition, disappeared. Blood demon fruit has not yet matured. Beast soul creation cannot be completed. Han Sen heard the announcement and thought to himself, it's a beast soul geno tree. I wonder when it'll finish maturing? Unlike the mantises, he wouldn't have to remain there and wait for it to finish maturing. All he would have to do was fertilize it with his water drops. Unfortunately, he had given most of his water drops to Zero, so she could continue growing the flying mushroom. He had been in the third god's sanctuary for 3 years, and in that time, the water drops would have most likely been used. Therefore, he thought he'd have to collect more sooner or later. Han Sen then gave up his plans to abandon the barrens and decided to take up residence in the shelter, so he could feed the tree with water drops every day. After 8 days, the tree fully matured, and when it had, all the egg fruit fell from their harboring branches. Following that, the tree hastily withered into a dry, sordid husk of what it once was. Over the course of a single day, it became a rotten thing that was barely fit to be used as firewood. Han Sen counted the blood demon fruit and came to a tally of 71. He gathered them all up in a mound on the floor. He, Queen, and Bauer all sat next to it. Let's start crushing them. These are yours, these are mine, and these are Bauer's. Han Sen, after proceeding to split the pile of eggs up, quickly got to crushing them. After crushing an egg, the image of a firefly formed inside the red light. It went straight into his sea of soul. Ordinary class blood firefly beast soul gained. Han Sen was surprised, and he gasped to himself, "What is this? I thought it was a monkey with wings. And why is it only ordinary class? Is that what the super creature wanted so much?" With a closer examination of the beast soul's attributes, Han Sen discovered it was a pet-type beast soul with only one gene lock open. It was useless. Bauer picked up a fruit and crushed it. For her, the image of a red unicorn formed, which disappeared after drifting towards her forehead. Han Sen was shocked. He only gave a pile to Bauer for fun, believing he'd still receive whatever she crushed. Aside from humans, only spirits that were owned by humans could own and make use of beast souls. Although rare, he had heard tales of a few creatures possessing the ability, but that was beside the point. If Bauer could accept a beast soul, though, did that mean she was human? Queen looked at Bauer strangely after witnessing this, too, but she didn't say anything. Queen picked up a blood demon fruit and crushed it. She was given a 4-winged tiger. "So, what did you guys get?"
Han Sen asked.
Bauer did not respond, but Queen told Han Sen, "I received a sacred blood flying beast soul." Queen then summoned the red wings. They looked beautiful on her. Han Sen did not tell her what he received and just tried to hide his jealousy. Immediately, he proceeded to break another egg. He knew it was little more than a loot box, in which whatever he received was random and purely down to luck. He wondered if there was a super beast soul amongst the eggs, but still couldn't fathom why the mantises wanted the tree and its fruits so much. When the shell shattered in the palm of his hands, the red light took the form of an ant. Then, it entered his sea of soul. Han Sen thought to himself, ant beast souls aren't the worst. If it was an ant-based super armor, that'd be spectacular. Primitive class blood ant beast soul gained. Han Sen didn't even bother looking at its further statistics, so he just picked up another egg and broke it. Ordinary class blood spider beast soul gained. Han Sen crushed another 8, and all he received were either ordinary or primitive beast souls. What the F***ck is this? Why am I so unlucky with my drops? Han Sen fell into a depression. Bauer crushed her second fruit, and Han Sen watched in awe as a blood-colored dragon twirled in the air. It roared and flew into her forehead. Han Sen knew that couldn't have been an ordinary or primitive beast soul, and it was clearly better than anything he was receiving. Bauer, what did you get?
Han Sen asked, looking at Bauer.
Bauer looked at Han Sen as if she had no clue what he was saying. Queen crushed 3 fruit, one by one, after each other. Then, she told Han Sen what she had received. I got a mutant blood wolf, a sacred blood 3-eyed snake, and a mutant firebird. I don't believe it.
Han Sen krushed a noteregg.
Ordinary class blood turtle beast soul obtained. Han Sen's demeanor was a mixture of depression and anger. Queen was aware of what was going on, and she struggled to hold her laughter. Bauer broke another fruit, and a grand grizzly bear roared and charged into her forehead. Good Bauer, very good. Hey, how about we swap? Han Sen then traded some of his fruit with the ones in Bauer's pile. Han Sen's confidence had been renewed after grabbing some of the eggs in Bauer's pile, and as he clutched one, he shouted to the skies, "This is going to work! Buddha, Laozi, Jesus, Arangasus, Mary, please, 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 bless me with immaculate fortune as I walk through the valley of shoddy loot crates." Hiya! Han Sen crushed the egg, and he watched the red light that oozed out with a manic stare. With his intense gaze, he waited to see the form it'd take. And then, all of a sudden, a housefly buzzed straight into his sea of soul. Ordinary class blood fly beast soul obtained. Han Sen felt as if his heart had been trampled underfoot, and he had now fallen into a deep depression. He continued tearing through the eggs before him, and he seemed to exclusively receive ordinary and primitive beast souls. Queen, on the other hand, had managed to receive 4 sacred blood beast souls. She never once received anything lower than a mutant class beast soul either. Bauer, although Han Sen could not tell their class, seemed to have been the continued recipient of greater fortune. Beast soul after beast soul rose from the cracked eggs, and powerful and monstrous red forms of light entered her forehead. Han Sen was down to 1 single fruit remaining. He wrestled with whether or not he should open it, and ultimately decided not to. He put it away. He had suffered a similar misfortune when he squeezed the dragon blood fruits in the underground shelter. He let Zero crack the final one open for him, and she managed to obtain a wondrous dragon blood snake for him to use. Bauer, you don't need those beast souls, so how about you give me yours? Han Sen gave the creepiest grin as he looked at her. Then, he took her in his arms. One, Bauer actually answered, putting up one finger as she spoke. Come on. You love Daddy, don't you? All?
Han Sen pleaded pathetically.
One, Bauer insisted. Han Sen swung his arms around, saying, Ooh, that reminds me. I heard there's a new flavor of ice cream. It's a super jumbo ice cream, too. It's massive. Bauer could not resist the temptation of a new super jumbo ice cream and said, 1 for each super jumbo ice cream. Deal. Han Sen then proceeded to lock his pinky with hers. Bauer gave Han Sen all the beast souls she had received, and Han Sen could not stop smiling as this occurred. They were all sacred blood beast souls except for one, which was a super beast soul. The super beast soul was that fierce dragon he had seen. Blood demon dragon, flying beast soul. Haha, it's a super class flying beast soul. I love you, Bauer.
Han Sen repeatedly kissed her cheeks.
Han Sen's fine mood had returned, better than ever. He had now managed to receive 2 super beast souls from his escapade at the shelter. First, he had managed to receive the super mantis armor, and now he had received super wings. With the wings, Han Sen could use phoenix techniques while remaining in his human form. The blood demon wings increased his speed and power, too, so that was a welcome trait. Han Sen summoned them, and immediately, giant dragon wings appeared across his back. He gave them a test flight and was delighted to learn he could fly at a speed that was greater than what the superclass mantis could achieve. Flying speed always came down to the beast soul itself. Although he wasn't as strong as one, Han Sen at least now had the speed to match any super creature. Queen thought it was ridiculous how he had received another super beast soul, particularly given the manner he received it, bribing it off Bauer. She then planned to give Han Sen the beast souls she had received and not keep them. Keep them? I don't need them, Han Sen told her. He also provided her with a few more sacred blood beast souls he did not need. You might need them to protect yourself in the event I'm not there. Queen did not say anything and just did as he said. She knew she was weak, and she could not hold her own and fight side by side with Han Sen as she might have once been able to. Han Sen then had another idea. He decided to give Queen his polluted devil horn king scimitar. As he did so, he told her, "Take this as well. I don't need it." Han Sen knew the creatures in the third god's sanctuary were strong, and the emperors there always had super creatures and spirits in their employ. He might need her backup, as many of the trials ahead might require him not to go solo. Since he did not need those beast souls, it was best to have a moderately powerful sidekick accompanying him. Queen accepted the scimitar but did not say anything. Safety first. If something happens to me, my life may be in your delicate hands. This gear will help, Han Sen said. Queen was too hard on herself, and even Han Sen thought the wounds she had sustained earlier were far too wretched. He didn't want to see her in a condition like that again. She blushed and simply walked back to the teleporter, returning to the Alliance. Han Sen also went back, bringing Bauer with him. He fulfilled his part of the bargain with her and bought her a lot of snacks. Bauer's luck was as good as zero's. Evidently, he could not open stuff and expect decent results. It seemed he would have to rely on Bauer for the time being. 2 days later, Han Sen planned his next route and set off away from the barons. Before he left, Bai Yishan gave Han Sen a call, bidding that he come visit him in the Saint Hall. On the communicator, Bai Yishan didn't mention exactly what he wanted to discuss, but it did sound important. Without any elucidation, he just told Han Sen to come see him in the Saint Hall. Bai Yishan had treated Han Sen like a proper student. It was something he was very grateful for. Therefore, Han Sen had no problem adhering to his desire and went to go see him at once. This was the first time he had been to the headquarters, as ordinary people weren't usually allowed. But Han Sen was not an official student, so he had to wait outside. Han Sen, why are you here? Han Sen heard someone ask. Han Sen turned around to see a man approaching. It was his once classmate Lu Ming, from the Black Hawk Military Academy. I am meeting with Professor Bai. Why are you here? I thought you became a vice captain for Heavenly Machine. Han Sen saw Lu Ming, dressed in a Saint Hall uniform. Their 304 living quarter roommates were still in contact with each other. They didn't see each other much, but they knew what they were each up to. Han Sen, however, did not expect to see Lu Ming there in the Saint Hall. Heavenly Machine was shot down by the Shura. I was going to go serve on another ship, but my mother has forbidden me from doing so. Instead, I have decided to become a researcher at Saint Hall. Lu Ming spoke with maturity and an elegance that was not overbearing. He was far from the kid Han Sen once knew. Something that big occurred? Why didn't you tell us?
Han Sen luked legitimately chockad.
Well, had I died, you'd have been informed. I walked away fine, so there was no point in worrying others. It's a waste of time for those who worry and a waste of time for those who are worried over. Lu Ming smiled softly for a moment, and then went on to say, I heard you were injured, though. How are you, all things considered? Much better, Han Sen said, enjoying the chat with Lu Ming. The two proceeded to speak about recent events and gossip as they had not done for the longest time. They discussed older topics too, in blissful nostalgia. They spoke of their school lives and what was going on with Zhang Yang, Shi Zhikong, Wang Mingming, Fat Leader, and Thin Man, even. Bai Yishan reached the lobby, at which point the closure of their dialogue was abruptly delivered. Han Sen, come to my office, Bai Yishan swiftly commanded. When he recognized who Han Sen was talking with, though, he had to ask, do you two know each other? Lu Ming was my roommate once upon a time, and he is a good friend. He was a bit of a bully during my study years, though. You better put a tight leash on this fellow if you're teaching him, Han Sen jested. Bai Yishan looked at Lu Ming's card and said, you are an intern. HM, come to my lab tomorrow. Find Mr. Li and he'll put you to work. Bai Yishan seemed to be in a rush, though, and so he said, now come, quickly. There is a problem. We'll talk later, buddy. Han Sen followed after Bai Yishan, concerned what matter could be so pressing. Lu Meng winked at Han Sen and then watched him go. It was rare for someone to work alongside Bai Yishan in his lab. Even the most experienced researchers could be forbidden from entering there, if Bai Yishan had no desire for them to have access. It was an extremely fortuitous opportunity, being invited to enter the lab, but he knew that if he was to act on the invitation, he'd have to be at his best performance. If he didn't have what it took, he could be removed from the lab with a snap of the fingers. The invitation meant one thing above all else, though, and that was Bai Yishan's favor and respect for Han Senator. Usually, a rigorous testing process was required before someone could enter such a prestigious lab. His association with Han Sen seemed to suggest Lu Meng could forego that. Bai Yishan brought Han Sen into his office and presented him with a set of documents. St. Hall has a rule. There is a program here, one we must all follow. Sign this document, and you can be made counselor of this project. You know this is classified, yes? Bai Yishan said. Han Sen read the document in front of him, and then signed atop the dotted line. So, what is this project? Why is there so much mystery? Han Sen asked, as he signed his name. Bai Yishan sent the document before responding. He contacted someone to confirm Han Sen's identity and said, "Come to my lab. We'll talk." Bai Yishan printed off Han Sen's worker card and pinned it to his chest. Bai Yishan seemed to be in a hurry, and he was scurrying about with haste. Even his speech was quicker than usual. He said, "You asked me if there is a hyper-geno art that can make a stomach stronger? You created one for me?" Han Sen was surprised and performed an emotional gesture with both hands clasped. Bai Yishan rolled his eyes and said, "It's not like you're my son, boy. I'm not going to treat you that well." Han Sen immediately looked disappointed and instead asked for clarification. "So, what's the big deal about my asking?" "I am researching a hyper-geno art called Hidden Blood. It might be something you'd have an interest in," Bai Yishan explained. "Hidden blood? To make your heart stronger?" Han Sen was disappointed. He already had heresy mantra for his heart, so there was no need for any other such skills or techniques. But Bai Yishan shook his head and said, "It's not for your heart. It's for your spleen." Spleen? Han Sen knew the word, but did not know much about it. The best he could recall was that it was an organ associated with the filtering of blood or something. Bai Yishan elucidated it for him, saying, "The spleen can filter blood and create blood." Han Sen listened to what Bai Yishan told him with interest as he walked alongside the man. He could understand a few words, here and there. Han Sen was more interested in saving money, though. He didn't concern himself too much with hyper-geno arts that dealt with organs of the body. That being said, Han Sen was surprised to find himself interested in hidden blood, after hearing what Bai Yishan was telling him about it. If what he was saying was true, it had to be a powerful hyper-geno art. It had to be one that would be quite beneficial for Han Sen. When they finally reached the lab, Han Sen was taken aback. It had to be bigger than the size of a football stadium. Aside from a few enclosed areas, the entire lab was partitioned by glass windows, where you could observe the researchers going about their various tasks. "There is a problem with it, though. I was hoping you might be able to help us with it," Bai Yishan said as they entered a private room. "What would this help entail?" Han Sen asked dubiously as he looked at Bai Yishan. The man's crooked smile was like that of an old, wicked fox. Bai Yishan answered, saying, "Hidden blood is just a name we have given it. But it is an ancient skill, one that was developed by a certain cult. The skill's original name was blood magic, and I can only suppose it was once regarded as being evil. These are the days of grays, though, determining what is good and what is evil, that which is black and that which is white, is a thing of the past. The roads to hell are paved with good intentions, after all. All that matters is the method and reason for which something might be used. And that is the case with hidden blood. I've been researching this particular skill for quite a few years, and I think it's time for the training wheels to come off and for it to be used properly." Han Sen was rather shocked by Bai Yishan's vivid and detailed explanation, but he still wanted to know more. He asked, "What do you mean?" Bai Yishan said, "Hidden blood increases the strength of one's spleen. It makes the blood itself stronger, and through using it, you can actually feel your bloodstream pump with greater energy. The blood itself is energized." "And what's so good about that?"
Han Sen asked.
It filters the dirt in your blood and concentrates it. Think of it like fuel for an aircraft. 1 liter of fuel can allow for the flight of 1,000 miles. If aircraft could learn hidden blood, that same liter of fuel could allow for a flight of many thousands of miles. It means you can store much more power inside your body. Bai Yishan looked very excited as he explained hidden blood to Han Sen. Bai Yishan was still not done, either. With a remorseful look, he said, "But we have a problem. Ordinary people cannot handle this energized blood pumping through their veins. More specifically, their hearts cannot handle it. Our bodies are designed for ordinary blood. After all, you want me to be your guinea pig?"
Han Sen said.
Bai Yishan looked at Han Sen and said, "Well, you have heresy mantra. Your heart and vessels are considerably more powerful than those of others. With your fitness level, you should be able to make use of hidden blood without issue." No way. Han Sen thought it to be a needless risk, one that was too dangerous. Think about it. A good generator needs good fuel. You have a powerful heart, but your blood is average. Don't you think that is a shame? Bai Yishan said. Han Sen told him, "You are right, yes. But being a lab rat," Bai Yishan said, "we have already conducted a plethora of tests. Blood magic cannot be controlled, though. It is addictive, to say the least. Once you have started learning it, you cannot stop. But that was the skill in its original form. We have tweaked it so that this is not an issue. You can stop practicing it whenever you want. Furthermore, we have developed pills that can revert your blood back to its ordinary, unrefined form." Han Sen was starting to look excited as he considered these prospects. He asked, "This skill is going to be forbidden soon, isn't it?" With an awkward expression, Bai Yishan admitted it by saying, "The rules and restrictions of the Alliance are too cruel." Han Sen thought to himself, "It's not about the rules, man. You're always researching the forbidden, evil arts. But don't worry, your talent is around 30% as good as mine. So again, like I said, you'll be fine. And you can stop learning it whenever you desire," Bai Yishan said. Bai Yishan then went on to say, "If you help me with this, I'll help you research a stomach hypergeno art. How does that sound? For the future of humanity, for the advancement of prosperity and peace across the galaxy, I, Han Sen, will submit and become your lab rat. This is a choice I will not regret," Han Sen agreed. He didn't like his current stomach hypergeno art, so if Bai Yishan was willing to create a better one for him, it was a worthy deal to accept. Han Sen thought Bai Yishan was right too. His heart really was strong, and it would have been best to have finer blood coursing through it. Han Sen was confident about his control over the skill, too, in that he'd be able to stop whenever he wanted. Bai Yishan gave Han Sen hidden blood's information and the Geno solution. He still respected Han Sen, so he wanted him to review the situation and what he was getting into first. There were risks involved with the skill, too. So, for the duration of his learning, he had to remain where he was and be monitored. Bai Yishan had arranged and done everything, even creating the classified documentation for Han Senator. Neither of them wanted information to leak, stating Han Sen had actually recovered from his crystallization blight. But Han Sen was prepared for his healing to receive exposure whenever that happened. It wasn't the biggest secret, and no harm would actually come from others learning he was better. "Little Han, you are so strong. I have never seen a surpasser as strong as you, especially where your heart and vessels are concerned. Dare I say, you were born to learn this skill, boy. You were born to learn it." Bai Yishan's constant compliments were becoming sickly. Han Sen gave up on the idea of leaving the Barrens for now, deciding to stay there, practicing hidden blood for the time being. He felt good practicing it. He used to believe his blood was already quite pure, but this skill taught him differently. After its filtering and refining process, he felt considerably stronger. His spleen was like a clean, energy storage facility that could constantly produce energized blood. The progress of practicing hidden blood came smoothly. There were no hindrances, and Han Sen was able to withstand the high-energy blood he was given. After 15 days, Han Sen became what could be considered a beginner. The energy in his blood, by this point, had doubled. Han Sen now had the time to enter the sanctuary and get to refining both life geno-essences. Bai Yishan had been satisfied by the results thus far, and when Han Sen got even better, he would document his experiences with the skill for information data. Of course, his experience was only one of the many things required, so it wasn't enough to complete the project to a degree of satisfaction. Bai Shan found Han Sen to ask him questions and learn whether or not problems with the hypergeno art came from the heart. If so, they could make the necessary changes. Ordinary people could not practice heresy mantra, but there were other hypergeno arts out there that could strengthen the heart. These were, however, not half as efficient. Han Sen had learned a lot from his time practicing hidden blood. In the past, Bai Shan had only given Han Sen information that could be found on Skynet. But now that Han Sen could learn it right there with him, it was great. Plus, spending time in the labs allowed Han Sen to observe a variety of different experiments conducted by researchers. There were hundreds of people there, running countless experiments at the same time. Bai Shan was in charge of hidden blood because it was his own personal project. Other projects were handled by those under his employ. Han Sen was captivated by the experiments, and on this day in particular, he lost track of time and missed his dinner. Fortunately for him, there was a vending machine there. He bought a snack and sat down to eat in the canteen. Ever since he had learned the stomach hypergeno art, he had had to eat a lot more. While Han Sen ate, a group of other people entered the canteen. It was past supper time, but still they came. One of the group was laughing loudly, and when he saw Han Sen, he stopped. The others, seeing him stop so suddenly, looked in the direction he had frozen. And then, they too saw Han Sen there. Han Sen glanced up and noticed it was Wang Lin. It was the person Han Sen had humiliated, back when they were on the Shui family's original planet. Han Sen continued eating, ignoring the man. He was friends with Wang Mingming and Wang Yuhang, so he wasn't too keen on keeping a rivalry with someone in their family. Wang Lin went back to talking with the people who were accompanying him. Unfortunately for him, Han Sen's ears were far too good. He could hear every single word that was spoken. Wang Lin told the story of what had transpired at the Shui family meeting, but reversed their roles entirely. Han Sen had mocked Wang Lin, saying he was a disgrace of a student for Professor Li, too. But Wang Lin had just said he was only insulting Professor Li, and he had stepped in to defend his teacher. Li Xinghua was there in the canteen with them, and although Han Sen had never seen him before, he knew who it was. The way he stood out from the others in the group was plain to see. His strength did not matter, though. This was the Saint Hall, and he could not freely attack Han Sen if he believed his students' words and wished to do so. The researchers, hearing what Wang Lin said, all looked at Han Sen with anger. Han Sen did not blame them, though. He'd be angry if he learned others had been insulting Bai Shan. One of the angry researchers approached Han Sen. "Did you say Professor Li has no clue how to teach students?" The man asked. Han Sen could not deny he said this, because he did, all for the purpose of mocking Wang Lin, who had verbally assaulted Han Sen first. If they were there, though, everyone would know Han Sen meant no ill sentiments toward Professor Li. After hearing what Wang Lin had told them, though, they obviously favored believing their colleague. "I did say that," Han Sen admitted. The researcher looked furious, and he said, "Apologize immediately. If you don't hold it against me for what I do next." If one of his students can beat me and prove me wrong, sure, I'll apologize, Han Sen said. "How? Through a fight? I thought you were disabled." The man seemed shocked, hearing the suggestion. Han Sen merely smiled and said, "We are researchers. He didn't teach you to kill." "Then what are you suggesting? How would we compete?" the man asked, frowning. Everyone researched different subjects, so it was difficult to find common ground. It wouldn't be fair for Han Sen to suggest something he had already studied. Han Sen smiled and walked before Li Xinghua. "Han Sen, what are you doing?" the researcher said, stepping between the two. Han Sen bowed to Li Xinghua, saying, "Professor Li, why don't you suggest a research topic we can research together? I lose if they are faster, and vice versa." Everyone thought Han Sen was crazy. Different researchers were good at different things, so if Li Xinghua suggested something Han Sen didn't know squat about, he'd immediately be at a disadvantage. Li Xinghua was their teacher. If he suggested a topic his students already knew, then Han Sen would also lose. Li Xinghua smiled and said, "Bai Shan does have a good student." The way Han Sen asked made him seem very self-confident. It also gave Wang Lin more material to attack with. Li Xinghua was famous in the Saint Hall, so if he suggested a subject to embarrass Han Sen, and Han Sen lost, it wouldn't reflect well on him. Therefore, someone like Li Xinghua wouldn't give an advantage to his students. He'd have to select a subject that was fair and square. If Li Xinghua suggested a subject and Han Sen won, it would mean Wang Lin and his colleagues were dumb. It wouldn't reflect poorly on Li Xinghua himself. There was no personal grudge between Professor Li and Han Sen, and Professor Li was most certainly not going to make himself an enemy on Wang Lin's account. Han Sen had thought of all this, so that was why he so happily made the suggestion to Li Xinghua. Wang Lin, with a spectrum of view and thought that was not as broad, believed Han Sen was merely being naive. "Teacher, give us a subject. We won't embarrass you," the angry man said. Wang Lin quickly retorted, saying no. He said, "Teacher, if he loses, he will say that it was because it was a subject you have taught us before." Wang Lin was still oblivious to what was actually going on. Li Xinghua simply smiled and said, "If you want me to suggest a subject, I will." Li Xinghua pulled out his communicator and sent information to Han Sen and Wang Lin. "This is what I have been researching in my own free time. Come find me when you have the results I wish to see." After that, Li Xinghua left. Wang Lin and his friends followed. Han Sen read the information he had been given while eating. It seemed like a fairly easy subject. It was very simple, as a matter of fact. The topic was on research on the energy flow cycle. Han Sen thought it was simple due to his experience with energy flows. When he uses Dongxian Sutra, he could simulate 3 or 4 different energy flows simultaneously. But the information he had been given concerned itself with something a little different. Lin Xinghua's research was about making 2 different energy flows run inside the body at the same time, but without either of them affecting the other. That meant practicing 2 hyper-geno arts without either touching. Han Sen didn't think such a thing was possible, due to the blood pulses being connected. Every qigong had to flow through the pulses, and they couldn't overlap. Li Xinghua had performed many tests with this subject. He had used many different hyper-geno arts in trying this out, but the results were always the same. They always overlapped. Han Sen knew it'd be impossible. When he practiced the Dongxian Sutra, he could only practice the Dongxian Sutra. He couldn't practice the Dongxian Sutra at the same time he practiced the Blood Pulse Sutra. If he ran 2 energy flows inside him at the same time, he'd be lucky if he didn't blow up. It was then that Han Sen realized the truth of why this subject had been selected. It was an impossible question, and it'd get him and Wang Lin to stop fighting. After returning to the lab, Bai Yishan called him. "Did you have an argument with Professor Li?" "I heard you had one," Bai Yishan inquired. "It was nothing." Han Sen then went on to tell Bai Yishan what had transpired. "Can I see?" Bai Yishan asked. Han Sen thought he might as well show Bai Yishan, since an answer wouldn't be possible. Bai Yishan looked very excited upon being shown what Han Sen had been given. He exclaimed, "Li Xinghua is good. That is why he is my #1 opponent. This is a very interesting theory." Han Sen looked confused, and so he asked, "But there is no solution to this, is there?" "It is impossible to solve, yes. And it is not just him who has been researching this. Many scholars have tried." Bai Yishan continued talking as he perused the information. He said, "Li Xinghua's thoughts and suggestions make people think. He has inspired me a great deal. But you can't solve it," Han Sen said. "Research does not require answers. Not everything on this plane of existence can be answered, and that is the beauty of research. There may be incidental results, but they are often viewed as being worth more than the subject itself. This research is comprised of many astounding theories, thoughts, and insights. For him to allow you to see this is brilliant." Bai Yishan went on to tell Han Sen, "Read this information. If you understand all that is written here, you'd fare well in the prospect of graduating." Han Sen was shocked. He didn't know why one minor, unsolvable subject such as this would fascinate Bai Yishan so much. Han Sen only now noticed the value of what he had been given. Han Sen went to read it further, and there was much in there that he did not understand. He had to ask Bai Yishan for clarification. Han Sen knew Li Xinghua didn't just want to resolve the tensions. He wanted them both to learn more and become better than 2 squabbling kids in the canteen. "Professor Li, you are very kind." Han Sen often consulted Bai Yishan for clarifications, but there was much even his teacher did not understand. Surprisingly, Bai Yishan let Han Sen ask Li Xinghua himself, "Is this appropriate?"
Han Sen asked.
Everyone knew Bai Yishan and Li Xinghua were enemies, so this was indeed a surprise. We have disagreements pertaining to the work we both share and love. There is no personal animosity between us. Feel free to ask him whatever you want, Bai Yishan said. Han Sen ended up not looking for Li Xinghua in his lab, as he could have been rather busy. So, he sent him a message instead. That way, he could ask all the questions he wished to pose to the man. He didn't really even expect a reply. But that very night, Li Xinghua gave his response, answering each of Han Sen's questions with keen insight. He even provided Han Sen with links to further reading material on the subjects. Han Sen saw his reply, and while he had received many answers, many of those answers merely led to him having even more questions. Every now and again, Han Sen would continue to send Li Xinghua a message with more questions. Each and every time, Li Xinghua would reply within a day or two. Now, Han Sen understood why Bai Yishan and Li Xinghua did not get along. He could see now that it was due to their different methodologies of research. Li Xinghua saw things at a broader perspective, encompassing a lot more. Bai Yishan was of a narrower vision, one that was fixed to the most minute of details. Their methods of research were polar opposites. Han Sen learned a lot from Li Xinghua. A month later, Han Sen finished the second stage of his testing of hidden blood. His spleen had become much stronger, the blood was twice as thick, and his heart was full of vigor. This wouldn't have worked on anyone else because the ordinary, natural human heart wasn't strong enough. It was the crux of the problem, and what Bai Yishan was most concerned with fixing. When Han Sen was done and dusted, he decided to return home. His trip to St. Hall had earned him a lot. Hidden blood was a marvelous thing to have been given. And with his time spent in the labs and the theories he had discussed and researched, he had walked away with a greater fascination than ever. If I can finish the research topic, which I'll just dub double cycle, from Li Xinghua, that potentially indicates that I can practice two hypergeno arts at the same time. Han Sen knew there'd be no answers, though. It was an enticing thought, but not one that could be resolved anytime soon. In regards to the double cycle research, it did give Han Sen inspiration for double fly. It was a dual-wielding skill that used the same energy flow for both hands. He now wondered if he could use two different skills, one for each hand. It wasn't exactly what the subject of double cycle concerned itself with, but it was a start. The energy flow was still connected, much like yin-yang blast. Han Sen wasn't going to give up on this seemingly impossible research topic, and he hoped that one day he could find an answer. And from those days onwards, whenever Han Sen had a problem, he'd ask Li Xinghua for guidance. This correspondence of theirs went on for a long time. Now, Li Xinghua was busy at work. He took a time out to answer him, and after he was done, he sighed. That day in the canteen, he had given this research topic to two people. And yet, despite that, only one had come to ask him questions. His students were smart, and they knew there was no answer to the subject to be found. But upon encountering an immediate dead end, they too came to a stop. They didn't carry on and invest in the research like Han Sen, despite it seeming like a futile endeavor. Two people had come to ask Li Xinghua once, but there was too much information to process, and they gave up. Only Han Sen persevered and tried to process all the information and make heads or tails of it all. Li Xinghua knew Han Sen was serious about this subject due to the nature of the questions he posed. To start off with, the questions seemed fairly basic and almost stupid, but they improved over time, which showed that Han Sen was a keen learner, and he had put true dedication towards the subject. When someone didn't understand something, it was only natural for them to make a mistake. Fixing a mistake was valiant, only if it led to an improvement of understanding with the crux of the problem. If someone understood everything, then research would not be necessary. Li Xinghua was impressed with the speed Han Sen came to understand things, and genuinely admired his dedication. Bai Yishan has a good student there. Li Xinghua was a little jealous. Smarty pants were everywhere, but many were just born that way. Passion was what Li Xinghua valued above all, and Han Sen had it in spades. Not to mention perseverance and patience. Back in the sanctuaries, Han Sen prepared himself for the coming journey. Queen had become a lot stronger over the month Han Sen had been gone, and she had incurred many wounds, too. Han Sen wondered what her super body might have been and was of the mind to ask. But everyone's super body was a secret, so he thought it'd be intrusive and rude to ask outright. Only Ji Qing and a few others had announced what their super bodies were, but they were merely names. No one actually knew what their super bodies actually did. Han Sen picked up Bauer and selected a trail that seemed most likely to lead to Thorn Forest. If they ended up getting lost, though, it did not concern Han Sen too much. His primary goal, as it always had been, was to slay super creatures. And if they did get lost and unknowingly venture into wild, uncharted lands, he'd be able to kill more of what he sought to. Queen slew most of the creatures along the way. With her super weapon and sacred blood beast souls, she had become a worthy partner to venture with Han. She could most certainly now accompany him in slaying a super creature. After reaching the outskirts of those barren lands, they came to a land with countless rivers running through it. The water of those rivers was extremely quick, and in those waters, many fish were leaping in and out. They opened their fins eventually and used them to fly upstream, above the current of the water. The fish were red, and their fins were shaped like wings. They were a meter long, on average. In this shoal of fish, one of the fish was 10 meters long. Its red scales shone brightly beneath the sunlight. The fish leaped up and down, below and above the water, as the rest of its fishy friends followed in a glide. Super creature? Han Sen felt a chill upon seeing this. He grabbed Queen and did not allow her to take one step closer. This super creature was different, which was why it made Han Sen act so cautiously. If this was any average super creature, he would never have been so careful. The life force of the big fish was extremely powerful, unlike anything Han Sen had ever seen before. He had seen much during his time in the Third God's Sanctuary, but nothing was comparable to that river fiend. Han Sen grabbed Queen and did not move a muscle. The fish in front of them might have opened 10 of its gene locks, so the last thing Han Sen wanted to risk was a provocation of its ire. Furthermore, the school of fish following it were all sacred blood at the very least. Their numbers alone would be overwhelming. Queen did not know how powerful the fish were, but she knew Han Sen well enough to know he wouldn't be so alert if they were not in peril. She complied with his obvious wish and stayed absolutely still. The Fish King must not have noticed the pair, so they merrily continued upstream.
Han Sen hid.
He was going to move once the fish were gone, but there were too many of them. The fish swarmed up and down every water stream they would need to cross. After a while of waiting, the bright skies succumbed to the onset of night. The river was sparkling beneath the moonlight, and the fish were all glowing and red. They illuminated the river beautifully. They were still all following where the Fish King had gone, and the vast number that passed by was almost unbelievable. Bauer was captivated by the beauty of this sight, and like always, she wanted a closer look. She climbed onto Han Sen's shoulder, and using it like a springboard, she dove directly into the river. The lanternfish were not afraid of her. Bauer grabbed a hold of one of them and rode its back. The fish was not angry or disturbed, and it just gave Bauer a merry ride. One moment it would glide through the air, the next it would be doing spins underwater. Bauer was delightfully happy while experiencing it. This isn't normal. It seems to me that something's afoot. Let's take a closer look and see what might happen. Seeing Bauer ride the fish, Han Sen wondered what the rest of the fish were all up to. He summoned Golden Growler, and with Queen, followed Bauer and the fish upstream. The river was completely red in their sparkling, ruby glow. If Han Sen had to wager a guess, he'd estimate there to be at least 1 million of the fish. None of the fish seemed aggressive, and they didn't bother any of the creatures that could be spotted in the waters of the river, either. Bauer was jumping about in great merriment, hopping along the fish as if they were stepping stones. They were all still tame, none looking as if they wanted to hurt her. Bauer became braver and braver. When they reached the Fish King, she hopped on its head repeatedly. Han Sen sweated profusely at the sight of this. Even if it was tame and not hostile, it was common sense not to disturb such a powerful creature. You could never be too careful, and doing something that might provoke the anger of such a creature was just silly. But, like the rest of the fish, it was uncaring. It just continued going upstream with the rest. The further upstream they went, the steeper the trail became. It eventually took them to mountainous highlands, and so stern were the slopes, Golden Growler could barely keep up. There was the occasional creature spotted alongside the river, but they all stayed away with the approach of the fish. They didn't seem as if they wanted to interact with them. All creatures had territory to call their own, realms they fiercely protected and reigned over, and yet, all creatures were fine with allowing the fish to pass through unhindered. It was a strange occurrence that Han Sen had never seen before. Han Sen eventually stood atop the peak of a mountain. In the distance, he saw a 100-meter-long water snake leave the river, allowing the fish to go on their way. There was a 10-meter-long crocodile at one point, and even a toad that was carried by a toxic-looking cloud. They even passed a water dragon, which departed its waters politely, allowing uninterrupted passage for the fish. That fish is pretty bad. Han Sen envied the respect the fish received. Seeing the docility of the Red Lantern Fish King, even with Bauer on its head, Han Sen fancied riding one of the lesser fish. But he wasn't Bauer, so he wasn't sure if he could. Creatures enjoyed attacking Han Sen, but they never seemed to go for Bauer. If Han Sen jumped onto one of the fish, they could end up killing him. Where are these lantern fish actually going? They followed the river for days, alongside the fish, and still, there was no end in sight. Curiously, though, the fish were beginning to pick up the pace and start swimming a touch faster. The fish stopped playing around eventually and just keenly followed their king. When the Fish King picked up its pace, many of the smaller fish ended up getting left behind. In the end, even Golden Growler could not keep up. And that was even after going at full speed. Golden Growler was strong, but it hadn't opened many of its gene locks. As such, despite its good speed, it wasn't as fast it could have been, and compared to the Fish King, it was rather slow. Han Sen requested Bauer to leave the fish and come back, but she shook her head and remained on top of the Fish King. Han Sen knew something big must have been on the verge of happening, but Golden Growler was starting to lag and get left behind just like the other fish. Han Sen told Queen, "I'll go on ahead. You follow the stream with Golden Growler." Han Sen stretched his blood demon dragon wings, and with his phoenix techniques, took off in a faster pursuit of the Fish King. This combination allowed Han Sen to follow the Fish King well, and he was no longer left behind. The Lantern Fish King was eventually going solo, for it had gone so fast, none of its brethren had been able to keep up. Only Han Sen could stick with it. Bauer was still sitting atop the Fish King, and as she sat there, she had a serious look on her face. Han Sen kept following the Fish King at this speed for 2 whole days. Fortunately, the wings were a beast's soul. If he was using his own energy to fly, he would have been knackered far earlier. Eventually, though, Han Sen saw the end of the long river he had traversed. It led to a big mountain, the peak of which was high up in the clouds someplace. An accurate estimation of its height could not be guessed. There was a big waterfall on the mountain, too. It descended from someplace above the clouds, as if it were a tether to hold the sky and clouds in place. It was a gorgeous sight, and before that grand waterfall, even the Fish King looked small. The waterfall descended into a lake. When the Fish King reached this lake, it began to stream up through the waterfall into the sky. Bauer held onto the Fish King tight, flying up with it. Han Sen shouted in her direction, but Bauer ignored him. She remained fixated on the mountain they had come to. The fish was swimming against the waterfall, and as it cleaved its way upwards, many splashes were created. Han Sen had the power to do this, as well, but he refrained for now. And as Han Sen was lost in thought over the place he had come to, something came down from above the clouds. Han Sen stood on the shores of the lake watching. Then, he saw a purple vine descend and try to lash the Fish King as if it were a whip. The Fish King puffed up its belly and withstood the blow like a red sun. Pang! The Fish King received that hit and bled a copious amount of blood. So much, the waterfall and lake below were dyed red. The Fish King opened its mouth and did not relent in its ascension of the waterfall. Pang! The vine was still there, and it lashed the king again. Many of the fish's scales were stripped from its body. Han Sen was frozen at the scene of this terrible sight. The Fish King was incredibly powerful as it was, but the purple vine was able to nearly wreck the beast with but a single hit. What in the sanctuaries could that thing be? Is it a plant? Is it a weapon? Is someone controlling it, or what?
Han Sen wondered, aghast.
His Dongxian aura was not efficient enough for him to detect what might have lurked above the clouds. What Han Sen couldn't understand the most, though, was why Bauer was acting the way she was. She was determined to remain on the Fish King, and her face was extremely serious. Han Sen had never seen her behave this way before. Does she know what is up there? Han Sen thought to himself. It did not seem possible. She had never been there before, so how could she know? Regardless, one thing was for sure. She wanted something. There had to be something up there, and she wanted it. Pang! The fish could not withstand this blow, and it could no longer continue its ascent. It fell all the way down to the lake below, creating a massive splash and tidal wave. Han Sen knew the Fish King could fly, but it must have been too weak to do so, following its third and final strike. The Fish King was not wholly defeated yet, though. It shone brightly, swimming around in circles before resuming its upwards flight. The head of the fish was now crowned with a golden horn. The moment the vine came down, the Fish King was able to skewer it with the horn. The purple vine emitted a mist, following this, and it was still active. It lashed the horn. Pang! The golden horn was shattered, and the Fish King fell back down into the lake once more. The Fish King was determined not to give up, though. It shone even brighter than it had before, and it was so bright, Han Sen found it difficult to watch. Han Sen used his Dongxian aura to view the king, and he was able to see it regenerate. The scales around it healed, and its tail at the back was like a chipper cloud. The Fish King leaped out of the water and flew upwards like a rocket. The purple vine whacked the fish again, shattering more of the scales. But the Fish King did not submit to gravity this time, and it continued onwards and upwards. As it went, the obliterated scales were like golden stardust, left as a wake for its star-bound pursuit. The vine was unable to stop the Fish King this time, but the seeming victory appeared to be short-lived. The illusion of success looked likely to crumble as another vine appeared. But the Fish King kept going. It pushed on and accelerated, despite the loss of its scales. It was so fast that the second vine was actually unable to do anything. And witnessing its failure to prevent the Fish King's ascent, the vines retreated above the clouds. Bauer's face looked more dour than ever, after withstanding all that. She now held the gourd in her hands as she stared up at the clouds she was fast approaching. Han Sen watched as the bleeding fish penetrated the clouds, and then, from somewhere above, the noise of thunder sounded. Purple lights appeared in the sky. The clouds were torn asunder by these lights, and the fish became a bloodfish. Its scales had all been stripped away. The moment the clouds were torn, Han Sen was able to see the peak of the mountain. There, atop the mountain, was an old vine. The two vines that had assaulted the fish were only a part of it, and the purple light that now flashed was sent out by the old vine. What is that thing? Han Sen looked at it in surprise. The clouds only remained open for a second, but in that time, Han Sen was able to discern that the vines were not growing from the mountaintop. They were actually the appendages of a monster. In the space of that brief look, the image of the monstrosity was seared into Han Sen's mind. The vines had a mind of their own, but they grew out of a living creature. This was something he had seen before. The gourd Bauer came from had brown upon vines that had writhed around the ancient bones of creatures. The vines were almost completely similar. The only difference was the absence of a gourd on the vine. That vine can't be a relative of Bauer's, can it? Han Sen wasn't so sure whether or not these things could bear gourds. Perhaps it one day would grow one. But there had to be some connection between the vine and Bauer. If there wasn't, she wouldn't behave in the manner she currently had been. During Han Sen's thought, the Fish King blitzed through the pain it had endured and dove through the clouds with its tail, breaking it like a thick mucus to provide passage. Once it was through, it went for the vine. The purple light shone again, but it was not like a blade. It created a swarm of purple bees that rushed to surround the Fish King. Bauer finally moved. She slapped her gourd, which allowed it to suck and ingest all the purple bees. Pang! The Fish King's body was sent crashing down the mountainside. But it was not content to stay there. It jumped up and headed for the vines again, as if it were in a desperate rush. It looked as if the fish was hungry to consume the vine, but before it could, the monster stood up. Its hideous head knocked the Fish King away, making it bleed even more. Roar. The monster let out a fearsome roar as it raced towards the Fish King with its vines lashing wildly. The Fish King shone gold and was unfazed by its gruesome foe. Quickly, it went to clash with the fell beast. A purple and gold light mixed together in mid-air. Han Sen flew up above the clouds to watch the fight unfold. Even with Super King Spirit Mode, Han Sen did not believe he was a match for either of the creatures. For now, he was content to just watch. Han Sen noticed the monster was different from the skeleton of the one in the second god's sanctuary, where Baoer's gourd had grown. Although only the bones had remained, he could immediately tell. This monster was like a ghost with horns. Its body shape, he could tell, was different from the one in the second god's sanctuary. Does Baoer have something to do with these vines? Han Sen watched the vines with ardent curiosity. The vines were quite frightening. They were like tentacles, growing from the raging monster that fought with the fish. But Han Sen could not see any fruit or gourds growing from them. Perhaps the vine fed on the monster's energy or empowered it. If it was just the monster fighting the fish, it would have been killed. The monster's vines kept hitting the fish. Their brutal powers were proving too much for the fish, though, and it was clearly going to be the loser in this battle. Despite having been ravaged and despite oozing gallons of blood, the fish was not willing to give up. It did not relent in its combat. The Fish King was getting weaker and weaker, and eventually, the vines managed to grip the fish and begin strangling it. The fish was made unable to move. The beast's horns managed to skewer the fish, and with the fish drained of its health, it was tossed crudely down to the lake below. The lake turned completely red after this happened, and unlike before, it did not immediately spring back into action. After a while, it slowly resurfaced. It wasn't dead yet, but the light was dim and fleeting. The wounds across its body were massive, and most of its body had been stripped of scales and flesh. Much of its skeleton was exposed. The fish struggled to regain its composure. It tried jumping up, but it got no further than a height of 10 meters, before falling back down. Baoer looked at the sky, looking as if she did not wish to give up just yet. Han Sen, seeing the Fish King die, went to pick up Baoer. After the fight, Baoer did not appear to have suffered a single scratch. Perhaps the vine did not want to injure her. He did not know. Baoer, what do you want up there? Han Sen hoped she would answer his question. Baoer continued looking up at the mountain and said, Dad, I want vine. For what purpose?
Han Sen asked.
I just want it, Baoer said. Han Sen kept asking her for more details, but she did not elaborate. He suspected she didn't even know herself, but there was some phantom urge compelling her to go. Han Sen stopped asking, but resolved to finish the Fish King off. He grabbed his phoenix sword and readied himself to plunge it deep into the creature. It was a super creature, one that might have opened 10 of its gene locks. It was dying, and now was his opportunity. Don't kill it, Baoer said. Why? Han Sen was confused, as she had never stopped him in such a way before. Baoer looked back to the mountain, saying, It is not our enemy. We need its help. In the future? Han Sen was surprised, and it seemed as if Baoer wanted that vine even more than he had thought. Considering her words, he decided against finishing off the Fish King. Killing super creatures was no longer a monumental task for Han Sen, so it was worth putting this one aside if it meant keeping Baoer happy. Han Sen was interested in the monster with the vines, though. If the Fish King could help with this situation, then it would be worth keeping. Han Sen simulated the silver fox's lightning and tried to heal the Fish King. But the Dongxian Sutra did not have a sufficient number of gene locks open, rendering the healing Han Sen could impart almost completely useless. The lightning didn't work very well on a creature as strong as that. After half a day of healing, Han Sen was knackered, and despite his efforts, the fish had only healed a tiny amount. This must be a berserk super creature. Up close and personal with the fish, Han Sen could now get a real feel for how powerful the Fish King was. It being a berserk variant was likely. The Fish King was looking better, though. It was now able to move. It turned to look at the mountain, and it seemed as if it wished to return. But it couldn't, and it looked regretful for knowing that, too. It turned away from Han Sen and Baoer and swam away downstream.
Baoer looked disappointed.
Han Sen was standing on top of the Fish King, holding Bauer in his hands. As they were carried along, Han Sen remained deep in thought over the connection that may have existed between Bauer and the vine. The Fish King swam for another half-day, and eventually, they encountered Queen. Queen was taken aback when she saw the fish, which had none of its scales left. Han Sen put away Golden Growler and invited her to come sit on the fish alongside him. He told her about what had transpired in the time he had been away, but made no mention of the possible connection to Bauer. So much of what happened is mysterious and inexplicable. If the Fish King was willing to die for it, it can only mean the vine is extremely valuable, Queen said.
Han Sen nodded.
He really wanted to find out more, but he acknowledged he was too weak to find out in his current state. He hoped he could somehow get the Fish King to return, fight, and beat the vine. After traveling for a while longer, the Fish King met up with its legion of lanternfish. When it reached them, they swarmed around to kiss its wounds. With each kiss from a lanternfish, a mote of light would depart their lips and soak into the Fish King's body. Miraculously, the Fish King's life force immediately began to replenish. More and more lanternfish offered their motes to the Fish King, and as this continued to occur, the scales began to sprout back and armor up the Fish King once again. After seeing this, Han Sen was ready to hit the road and return to the mountain. But Bauer stopped him and said, "Daddy, it will take us." "Take us? Take us where?"
Han Sen asked.
"It saw someone who looked like us," Bauer said. Han Sen looked at Queen. If the fish had seen other humans, it meant they could be taken to a human shelter. If that was true, that would be great news. The fish recovered and swam quickly downstream. After just under a day of travel, the Fish King stopped and skirted a bank of the river. When Han Sen looked at where they had come to, he was shocked. There were thorny vines wreathed around the ordinary forest flora. Wherever they were, they couldn't be too far from thorn forest. They disembarked the Fish King and looked back at it. It shook its tail as if to wave goodbye, and then took off swimming. "Bauer, how do we find the fish again?" Han Sen looked at the river. It was a large river, but not in the grander scheme of the land. Finding where they had come from would be difficult. "It will go there," Bauer said, as she looked off in the direction of the mountain. For now, there was nothing Han Sen could do. Even with his Super King spirit mode, he could not do battle with the Vine Beast and expect victory. Fortunately, the Vine Beast did seem to have one limitation. It never seemed to leave the lofty peak it resided upon. If it truly was afraid to come down, that was good for them. Han Sen shuddered to think of what might have happened if it had followed them down. "When I get stronger, I'll go back for that vine," Han Sen thought to himself as he walked towards the forest. Eventually, they came across human footprints. That told Han Sen humans had to be around, someplace. After 10 miles of walking, the trio stumbled across a castle, nestled between the trees. There, he could see humans fighting creatures. "Friends, where have you come from?" someone asked Han Sen and Queen. "Our shelter is someplace nearby, but we are lost," Han Sen answered dubiously, wanting to test their intent. "You are lucky then. Venturing through this treacherous forest alone is no small feat. You are fortunate to be breathing," the man exclaimed, with genuine surprise. Han Sen was delighted to hear his words, as it meant Thorn Forest must have been around. The forest they were currently in, as Han Sen later learned, was called the Forest of 1,000 Insects. It was a forest that neighbored Thorn Forest. The wide rivers bordered one length of this forest, which was nice. But what was even better was that there was only one royal shelter in the vicinity. The humans lived inside it, but Han Sen could not guess why it had been empty when they found it. Thorn Forest and the rivers were said to be dangerous, but the Forest of 1,000 Insects wasn't. It was primarily populated by ordinary, primitive, and mutant creatures. The humans were fortunate to live there. After the trio entered the shelter, they were warmly welcomed. There was much joy to see, and the humans all seemed to live in harmony with each other. Everyone aided everyone else, and there seemed to be no conflict, competition, or strife. Han Sen and Queen decided to remain there for a short while, and in the meantime, Han Sen returned to the Alliance and pinpointed exactly where he was. Perhaps it would be possible for him to move the underground shelter. Since that location was not too far from the river, and the river led to the Vine Beast, Han Sen planned to remain in that forest for quite some time. Han Sen returned to the Alliance and used what little information he had to figure out where he was in the grander scale of the third god's sanctuary. Han Sen stayed at the shelter for a while, and when he figured out where he was, he asked Moment Queen to move the shelter close to them. Unfortunately, the underground shelter could only move a certain distance with each teleportation. It would take a month for it to reach Han Sen. The shelter they were at was called Nest. There were around 40 people living there, with the population spread across a vast manner of different ages. The eldest among the people were over 100 years old. The area around it was rather safe, and any surpasser that came to be there was guaranteed a good life. The people at the shelter said only 5 people had died there in over 100 years. 2 of them died while venturing into a creature's nest, whereas the others died while trying to brave either thorn forest or the waters. Han Sen was surprised to learn there was a nest there, and Uncle Bug told him this nest was in the very center of the forest. No one dared to go there, and on the few occasions that they had snuck in, the eggs inside the nest had proven too sturdy for them to break. Uncle Bug was the leader of the shelter. He was the oldest there, and he was the founder of the shelter. As such, he had the authority of leadership. He didn't focus too much on himself, and he was always more concerned with helping others. Whenever someone new arrived, he'd make sure to provide them with beast souls to begin or aid them in their time in the third god's sanctuary. Having a leg up, and having the proper equipment to deal with creatures of that realm right from the start, was an invaluable and much appreciated boon. He was titled Uncle out of respect. His age meant nothing to the people of the shelter. He was a good man. The reason he had the name Bug was because of the beast souls he usually gave out. He loved handing out beast souls, but they were always some sort of bug, and on a day-to-day basis, he had a dozen bug beast souls all around him, too. As for what Uncle Bug's real name was, none knew. The new people who came to the shelter would always receive a bug pet beast soul as a welcome. They weren't powerful, but they were a worthy aid for newbies when fighting ordinary creatures. When Han Sen and Uncle Bug saw each other for the first time, Uncle Bug looked at him strangely. He was sensitive enough to tell that Han Sen studied both the Dongshin Sutra and Jade Skin. Han Sen initially believed Uncle Bug's peculiar reaction at their meeting was because the man had recognized him. When considering Han Sen's past glories, it wasn't too far-fetched to believe he was a recognizable face, after all. He was once a household name of the Alliance. People still believed he was sick, though, so it would catch anyone off guard to see him frolicking about the forests of the third god's sanctuary. Uncle Bug was very nice. He took Han Sen and Queen on a tour of the area around the shelter, informing them both about the forest. When he was done, he provided them both bugs. When Queen learned of Han Sen's intention to remain there, she decided to go out on a hunt. Han Sen, in the meantime, decided to visit the center of the Forest of 1,000 Insects. For most surpassers, such a place was deadly. For Han Sen, it was a trove of goodies he could easily plunder. If the eggs inside there were super creatures, it was sure to be a wonder. What Han Sen currently needed most were super genes. He wasn't particularly interested in anything else, so he just flew straight for the center. While traveling through the air, Han Sen caught sight of a mountain peak in the distance. It was like a blooming lotus flower, the top of which looked like an entrance. He guessed it was the entry to the nest. Han Sen flew there and saw an abundance of bugs, all possessing gold shells. Like beetles, they all had shiny gold horns. Their claws were like saws, too. There had to be at least 100 of the critters. At the most, they looked to be mutant creatures. Therefore, Han Sen was too lazy to kill them. Traveling to the center of the mountain, he found a cave. It was the entrance to the nest. Han Sen looked inside and noticed the surprising absence of creatures. He put on his super mantis armor and summoned Disloyal Night. Disloyal Night entered first, but the path was clear of creatures for its entire length. They approached a crystal wall, and they found it already broken. Someone had been there before them. Han Sen looked around and saw no creatures or living things in the area around them. Under the green light of the shattered crystals, Han Sen noticed the presence of many broken bug shells. They weren't in the best condition, and they looked as if they had been ripped and torn off the creatures they may have once belonged to. Some were bigger than train cars, others were as small as one's fist. They were everywhere in that cave. This is a strange place. Has someone come here and killed all the creatures? Han Sen thought to himself. People said two had come to this place before. One died inside, while the other escaped but eventually died. Anyway, Han Sen did not expect a duo such as that would have what it took to kill so many creatures, large and small. Perhaps someone else had come to this place before Han Sen had. Han Sen was disappointed. He feared the eggs further inside would already be broken. If they had, this entire venture would have been a waste of time. Since he was there already, though, he kept exploring, and he wouldn't turn back unless he could confirm the condition of the eggs that were said to reside there. He continued on. The bug shells were everywhere, and Han Sen couldn't help but frown when seeing them. The broken shells were strange to see. They did not look as if they had been removed from the creatures with a fine weapon. The whole cave was littered with the shells, and there was not a single living thing to be found. When Han Sen reached the deepest recess of the cave, he was dismayed to learn there was nothing there. No eggs, nothing. Who could have done all this and broken the eggs? Is this the work of a human or a spirit?
Han Sen frov ned.
It was pointless to wonder now, though. But just as Han Sen readied himself to depart, he was overwhelmed with a chill that suggested he was in immediate danger. He turned around and threw a punch without thinking. The gauntlets collided with a dark green claw, and when they met, the force sent him flying backwards. As he careened through the cavern, he broke through many crystal walls. Disloyal Knight ran to the monster to engage it, providing time for Han Sen to stand up. The pain he was feeling was excruciating, but he knew he did not have the time to wallow around. When his eyes focused, he was shocked to see Disloyal Knight in conflict with a dark green spider. It was the size of a household room, and it was hairy. Disloyal Knight threw a punch, but before it could land, the spider fired a web to tangle and nullify its potential damage. Disloyal Knight was strong, but the web was far too sticky for him to do anything against it. The web was like a million syrupy rubber bands. The web knotted its way around Disloyal Knight's arm, and the spider continued to unleash stream after stream of the web. Eventually, Disloyal Knight was practically cocooned. He had been rendered unable to move. Pang! The metallic claws of the spider struck against Disloyal Knight's armor and left a deep cleft across his chest. With its foe trapped and unable to move, the spider made the most of this opportunity to keep attacking. Han Sen now knew what the shells were. They were the shells of bugs that had been killed by the spider. The meat of the prey had all been eaten, leaving behind the ruined remains of a husk. That's what the tattered shells were. This spider must have been birthed from the egg that was said to be here. What a horrifying creature, to murder and dine on so many hapless victims. It makes me shudder. Han Sen was strangely excited about this ordeal. The eggs had not been taken, and neither had they been eaten. They had become a super creature. Han Sen summoned his gold raven beast soul and transformed. With his blood pulse sutra, he activated his 9 gene locks. The spider, seeing this other threat, then turned to fire webs at Han Senator. They were hopeless against him, though, as the webs were immediately incinerated by the bird's fire. Han Sen swooped in close to the spider, and with his talons, he cut the spider with a grisly swing. Immediately, the spider began to gush green blood. Han Sen then spun around and fired a geyser of flame towards Disloyal Knight to free him. The trapping web was scorched away, freeing him to do combat once again. Following this, Han Sen and the knight cooperated in attacking the spider. With Disloyal Knight's halo and Han Sen's volcanic assaults, the spider stood no chance. There was no place for the spider to run or hide inside the cave. And within the hour, Han Sen was able to deliver the final blow, crushing its brain. Super creature Cruel Spider King killed.
No beast soul gun.
The flesh of this creature is inedible, but you may harvest its life geno essence. Consume its life geno essence to gain 0 to 10 super geno points randomly. Although there was no beast soul, Han Sen was still pleased with the result. He did not expect to receive a life geno essence again, quite so soon. When the body decomposed, though, something else was left behind. It wasn't just the life geno essence this time. Han Sen's jaw dropped when he saw what it was. It was a gold card, one emblazoned with the 9-life cat emblem. The card was red and around the size of a man's hand. On its back was the number 7. Han Sen examined it closely, but could not learn anything more. He had no clue why it had been left there, inside the belly of that spider. He took the life geno essence and walked around, wanting to ensure he had not missed anything. Han Sen eventually returned to Nest Shelter and asked Uncle Bug a few questions. The answers he received were disappointing. The scariest place in the region was the nest he had just been to. Aside from Thorn Forest and the water, is there anywhere else strange and treacherous I might venture?
Han Sen asked.
Han Sen did not want to go to the water. The last time he was there, the Fish King made all the creatures run off. In case he needed to traverse the banks of those wide rivers again in the near future, the last thing he wanted to do was provoke the kind inhabitants that had once respectfully provided him passage. Thorn Forest was a mysterious place. It was wild and unpredictable, so without the safety net of his underground shelter, he wouldn't dare venture there. There is still one more peculiar spot, here in the Forest of 1,000 Insects, Uncle Bug said. What place would that be?
Han Sen asked.
Uncle Bug remained silent for a few moments, before telling Han Sen, there are 3 small hills that skirt Thorn Forest. They are around 500 meters tall, with a valley between them that is completely devoid of life. One dead spot, surrounded by the abundance of vegetation everywhere else in this land. Creatures have been known to wander in, but never wander out, and occasionally, you can hear the distant voice of a baby crying. Uncle Bug went on to say, I've been here all these years, and never once wanted to set foot in that place. What you might find there, I haven't a clue. But for what it's worth, I would advise against traveling there. Han Sen feigned agreement, but secretly thought to himself, this is exactly what I wanted. Han Sen asked where that place was, so he knew where to avoid. His next trip was set. Han Sen had managed to collect 3 life geno essences by this point, but none had been fully absorbed. I need to get my *SS in gear. Otherwise, I won't be able to absorb it. Han Sen thought about buying a genofluid to help synthesize and speed up the absorption process. He was tempted, but he ultimately chose not to. Firstly, it was too expensive. Secondly, he did not know whether or not there were any unwanted side effects that had yet to come to light. Before going to the strange valley that he had been told about, Han Sen decided to open his 5th gene lock first. He had opened the Dongxian Sutra's 4th gene lock a long time ago, but he had held off on opening more due to his injury. One had been opened by Big Mara, but he had managed to shut it down and close it. So, for now, Han Sen focused on his Dongxian Sutra. His fitness was sufficient to support the 5th gene lock being open, and since it had been opened once before, it was an easy and smooth process to open it again properly. The moment he opened the 5th gene lock, his head felt as if something inside it had snapped. The radius of his Dongxian aura had not increased, but he felt different with it. Han Sen could sense a lot of things inside that aura with his 7th sense. But that was before. Now, his sensitivities had widely increased. He had the 8th sense. Now, when he was scanning someone, he could get a feel for what they were thinking. He used his Dongxian aura and scanned the area around him. There was a guy called Wang Lin there, and he was currently busy slicing up the carcass of a creature. He wasn't speaking at all, but Han Sen could sense what he was saying to himself with his mind voice. After I eat this mutant flesh, my geno point tally will reach 76. Han Sen didn't think it was possible to do this, but he knew it was impossible for him to guess something so detailed. He thought his Dongxian aura was somehow lifting the signals of their brain. Han Sen scanned the others and realized he was correct. Xiao Mei is a slut. I almost broke my back last night. I'll have to remedy it with some oil later for round 2 tonight. I'm going to *CK her to death. Where should I go to kill creatures? Killing worms is too dangerous, but killing bugs is too simple and lame. *CK. That asterisk surely tricked me. I'm going to *CK him up the next time I see him. When he focused on a person inside the aura, Han Sen could read their minds in real time. He could also get a perfect sense of how someone was feeling inside. Can I hear the thoughts of creatures? Han Sen focused on Bauer, who was currently scarfing down some grub. Unfortunately, Han Sen was unable to hear a single thing. Instead, he turned his attention to the bird that was sitting on Bauer's shoulder. Much to his surprise, he was able to discern its thoughts. She never shares any food with me. What AB asterisk TCH? Han Sen was incredibly excited over this new ability, and he was giddy to try it out on everything he could. He ran straight into the forest to hear the thoughts of all the creatures he could find. Eat, eat, eat. Hungry, hungry, hungry. Han Sen noticed most other creatures were simple-minded. Han Sen now had a better understanding of what the fifth gene lock provided. He could hear the thoughts of others, but only if their feelings were strong and at the forefront of their minds. The stronger their thoughts, the clearer Han Sen could hear them. Han Sen thought about the long-term viability and usefulness of the power, as most super creatures had the eighth sense. That meant there was no use trying to hide from their seventh sense. This skill didn't have a clear purpose, so Han Sen was unsure what to make of it. It enabled Han Sen to simulate energy flows with greater efficiency, though, so at least the refinement of life geno-essences was faster. If I have 9 tiers, does that mean I'll be able to read anyone's mind with crystal clarity? Han Sen wondered to himself. The Dongxian Sutra meant you could see through things, even that which was in heaven. The thoughts of all humans could definitely be read. Han Sen would have liked to open the 9th tier then and there, but there were no shortcuts available. Han Sen went back to the shelter, walking right past Uncle Bug. Han Sen focused on him, and he heard a shouting voice boom inside his head. No way is he Han Jingji's heir. But why does he claim that his grandpa is Han Jingji? And why does he have the 9-life cat on him? Han Sen heard this and felt a shiver run down his spine. Uncle Bug knew about his family. If Uncle Bug had run a background check on Han Sen and the Alliance, it might have been normal for him to have learned about Han Sen's father and grandfather. But there was no way Uncle Bug should have known Han Sen had the 9-life cat. Han Sen recalled his first meeting with Uncle Bug, and how Uncle Bug acted strangely and gave him an odd look. He might have seen Han Sen's necklace, but Han Sen was wearing armor, so the man shouldn't have been able to sense or see it. This guy must have some connection to Blood Legion and Han Jingji. Han Sen would have loved to open his brain and get a proper look at what had been running through his mind. Uncle Bug, where are you off to? Han Sen asked, looking at Uncle Bug. I am going to Redbug Lake to collect some more meat, Uncle Bug answered. You are strong, and you're around the same age as my great-grandfather. Perhaps you met him at some point? It's a shame he is dead now, though. His name is Han Jingji. Have you heard about him?
Han Sen asked, Koilu.
Uncle Bug gave a strange look at first, but then he smiled, saying, That name eludes me, sorry. Han Sen wished to say something more, but Uncle Bug quickly waved his hand and said, I need to go to Redbug Lake now. We can talk later. Watching Uncle Bug leave, Han Sen knew he had caught the man off guard. Uncle Bug was a little nervous in his response. Han Sen wished to find out what had happened in the past, but no one ever wished to talk about it. Not even Sunset could tell him. It was incredibly unlikely but fortunate for him to have met Uncle Bug, and Han Sen was fond of the area around the shelter. He knew he couldn't push the old man too hard for information. Not yet, anyway. How can I get Uncle Bug to reveal more? Han Sen wrestled with a number of different methods he could try, but none seemed viable. So, he decided to find out more about who Uncle Bug actually was. People only knew him by the queer nickname, so he fancied trying to dig a little deeper beyond the name Uncle Bug. Han Sen even asked someone to compose an image of the man. With this portrait in hand, Han Sen perused Skynet to learn more about Uncle Bug's true identity. Unfortunately, he couldn't find a trace of the man. Uncle Bug gave Han Sen an uneasy feeling in his stomach, and his mere presence was different than what Han Sen received off others. Han Sen concluded his investigation with lame results. Nothing new was learned. He hadn't even found the man's real name. Han Sen asked the elders in the shelter, who looked to be close with Uncle Bug, but learned nothing from them either. They spoke a lot, but didn't actually say much, so to speak. Han Sen now knew there was something off about the man, but he wasn't sure how he'd get him to talk. Uncle Bug continued to pretend he didn't know anything upon future inquiries. It was rather frustrating for Han Sen. Han Sen's Dongxian Sutra could not follow every train of thought or scan through the mind of a person as if it were an archive. Had he been able to do this, Han Sen wouldn't have gone to such lengths to find out info elsewhere. But he knew he had to be careful and not scare Uncle Bug off. If he was too pushy, things could turn ill. What's more, if Han Sen ever left this shelter, he wouldn't know where to find him back in the Alliance. Han Sen decided to drop the investigation for now and resume his previous plan of heading for the strange valley he had been told about. He went there with Bauer. Finding a super creature in the forest of 1,000 insects was a very difficult affair, as the knotted realm was rather tame compared to other regions if one did not venture too far. Han Sen went to the deserted area and saw the 3 hills, which acted as a crude border wall separating the forest of 1,000 insects and thorn forest. The hills were not too tall, and they stood at a height of around 500 meters. They were quite plain and barren. Han Sen flew into the sky to get an aerial view of the space. As he had been told, there was a Y-shaped valley devoid of any visible life. It was like a dead canyon, cloaked in white sand. He wouldn't believe it was entirely empty, however. Giving the place a scan, his suspicions were confirmed. He found something. In that valley were numerous holes. They were all the size of a fist, roughly, and looked like little tunnels that belonged to a nest. Han Sen's Dongxian aura could not see through the thick walls, unfortunately, so he could not get a proper scan of what might lay inside. He did hear a noise, though. He wasn't entirely sure what the noise was, but he acknowledged it wasn't too dissimilar to the crying of a baby. Uncle Bug had told him about the noise, but Han Sen was still surprised to hear it just as he said. And he could hear it from quite a distance away, too. Whatever creature is making that sound, it seems as if it resides beneath here. I'll have to draw it out somehow. Han Sen had an idea of how to do just that. So, he returned to the forest and caught 2 tank bugs. Han Sen cut each of them up and tossed them into the valley. The 2 tank bugs had not been killed, they had just been badly injured. They squirmed around in agony, trying to escape the place, as blood squirted everywhere. Watching the bugs leave the valley, another thought cropped into Han Sen's head. Are those creatures not interested in the tank bugs? As Han Sen thought about this, the tank bugs were successfully making their escape. Or so it seemed. The tank bugs were only 10 meters away from the exit. But then, they just vanished. The trail of blood they had left in their wake stopped in the exact spot they disappeared from sight. Stranger still, it didn't look as if something had pulled them down into the sand. The 2 bugs just vanished before Han Sen's eyes, with no warning or indication of where they had gone. Han Sen had already activated his Dongxian aura, so if something peculiar had happened, he should have noticed it. But the 2 injured tank bugs suffered a fate that made no sense. Han Sen gritted his teeth and flew back into the forest again. He grabbed a few more bugs, wounded them, and tossed them into the valley. This time, Han Sen focused on them intently. He wanted to watch where they went exactly. He had tossed in ordinary and primitive class creatures, and they looked to be panicky and desperate. They urgently wished to escape the valley. Han Sen's pupils shrank as he saw 3 of the bugs vanish. With no indication of another creature or unexpected movement, they disappeared right in front of his eyes. The other 2 bugs tried to make themselves scarce, but it wasn't long before they were taken by the phantom that seemed to plague those sands. What is this? Han Sen looked over to where they disappeared and scanned the area. There was nothing to be seen. Again, 5 bugs had just immediately gone missing. Are there any cracks in the space of this place? Maybe they slipped into another dimension or something. Han Sen was shocked by what was going on. Han Sen was glad that he had not wandered into the valley himself. But, wanting another look, Han Sen went away to collect more bugs. When he had a few more, he tossed them down towards the sands below. The results were mostly the same, though. This time, Han Sen scattered the bugs all around, but they all still vanished. They were able to disappear from any corner of that valley, and not in just one spot. Han Sen spent more time conducting these tests, tossing dozens and dozens of bugs each time. Despite his best efforts to uncover what was going on, he was as clueless as when he began. His crack in space theory seemed unlikely, too, given that the bugs could disappear from anywhere. If there was a rip in space, it would most likely take the form of a single large hole. Although it was difficult to detect the presence of cracks in space, Han Sen's keen eyesight should have allowed him to notice the slight shimmering they often gave off. With no other clues or ideas about what might have been happening, the thought still weighed on his mind. He didn't dare go to the valley himself, though. Han Sen remained above, watching from the top of a hill in safety. Eventually, the stars rose and the moon gleamed brightly above the land. Despite the hours spent there, Han Sen wasn't able to deduce anything. The region he was situated in was eerily silent, but he remained there stubbornly. He peered into every nook and cranny of that place, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing that peculiar phenomenon. Unfortunately for him, he learned nothing. If there was a creature lurking beneath those sands, how could it have snatched the bugs without a trace? As Han Sen's mind wandered, a rustle in the trees startled him. Han Sen looked into the forest that was a distance away and saw a man appear. It was Uncle Bug. Han Sen was shocked, not expecting to see Uncle Bug casually approach the valley on foot. He said it was dangerous to come here. He warned me to stay away. Why is he coming here himself?
Han Sen frov ned.
Uncle Bug was carrying a sack, and something seemed to be wriggling inside. Han Sen tried to determine what it was through a scan. All he could learn was that it was alive, and that it possessed a life force. Uncle Bug approached the entrance of the valley and stopped. He peered across the sands of that place and tossed the bag onto the sands below. Uncle Bug was strong, clearly. The sack was large, the size of a human. Despite that, he was able to toss it an entire kilometer. Whatever was in the sack looked to be panicking, and it thrashed around frantically after it came crashing down to the ground. Unfortunately, it had been sealed tight, and whatever was inside could not escape. Han Sen looked at the bag and thought to himself, what is inside that? Is he doing what I did? Is he trying to uncover what lurks inside this valley too? All of a sudden, Han Sen heard the sound of a baby crying once more. It was incredibly sharp, just like Uncle Bug had told him. It was unnerving and unsettling. The baby's sound was as if it had been traumatized. Han Sen then realized the sound was coming from the holes he had examined earlier. In that Y-shaped valley, the holes were emitting the sound of a shrieking baby like speakers. The only unclear thing was which hole the noise was coming from. Quickly, Han Sen received his answer. After he listened closer, he realized that each and every hole was making the noise. Then, something even creepier occurred. Countless scorpions began to pour out of the holes. Thousands of the critters began to cascade from the sandy orifices, all heading for the bag and whatever was inside it. The scorpions were about the same size of a fist. They were black, but without sheen. On their backs was the faint picture of a human face. It was like that of a baby, giving off a creepy, devilish smile. When the scorpions moved, the smile looked like it was living and moving. It totally creeped Han Sen out. The scorpions did not look strong, but they were scary enough to make Han Sen feel frightened. When Han Sen mustered the courage to scan them, he learned they were just mutant creatures. But since there were all mutant creatures, even that group was a force to be reckoned with. Han Sen's only question was why they all came out when Uncle Bug threw down a prize. What is he up to? Han Sen looked at the scorpions and wondered. Eventually, the human-faced scorpions reached the sack. Then, whatever was inside managed to roll out. When Han Sen saw what emerged from the sack, his body flared with goosebumps and his head got all itchy. The person that emerged from the bag was a man who was very skinny and seemed to be around 30 years of age. It was a living person, and Han Sen could see the fright that twisted his face. Before Han Sen could return from his thoughts, the scorpions were stinging the poor man. He was stung many times, like he was being deliberately tortured. He rolled around on the ground, writhing and screaming in agony. It is all a ruse. How can Uncle Bug feign such kindness every day, when this is the sick and twisted stuff he gets up to on his own? How could he even think to torture a man like that? Han Sen's spine was frosting over with the chills he was feeling. When Han Sen next looked at Uncle Bug, he froze. Uncle Bug was crying. As he watched the man get stung all over, he himself looked as if he was in pain. Amidst the tears, he prayed over the man down below. It was then that Han Sen realized the man being tortured looked familiar, like someone he had seen in the shelter. Uncle Bug was being very emotional. Han Sen used Dongxian aura to get a read of the man's feelings and see what he could hear of the man's thoughts. But all he could hear was screaming. There was one word he was able to discern, though.
Son?
Did he say son? That can't be his son. Han Sen exclaimed in his head as he turned to look at the naked man. He couldn't even begin to fathom why Uncle Bug would treat his son in such a manner. But people wouldn't lie to themselves in such a situation. He had heard Uncle Bug scream it was his son. Han Sen could not have been mistaken. Now, the body of the person on the ground was all swollen. The natural assumption would be to presume he was dead, or was going to be in such a state. He had been a rather skinny man when Han Sen first saw him. Now, he was swollen like a fat man. The man could no longer scream, but his muscles still twitched with the pain he was continuing to endure. Uncle Bug continued to pray as tears drenched his face. As he did so, his teeth chattered in what had to be fear. Han Sen had never seen anything as remotely curious, horrific, and upsetting as this. He had no idea how he should feel about what was going on. Just as Han Sen thought the man was about to be dined on, he heard the baby cry again. It wasn't sharp like before. The sound of the baby was rough and coarse. When the noise echoed across the valley, all the scorpions returned to their holes. Soon enough, all that remained was a man who looked much like a bloated pig. Uncle Bug looked at the dying man in the valley. Han Sen was keen to know what had happened, why this was happening, and what was to happen. He was sweating with nervousness. This entire scenario seemed bizarre. When Han Sen looked at the man, he noticed his shadow appeared to be strangely large. The man was like a pig, but there was no way his shadow was 3 meters tall. The shadow was very weird. Half of it looked like a man, and the other half looked like a scorpion. The shadow came to life and moved. A person with long black hair and eyes that were as black as coal emerged. His muscles were thick and ripped beneath the black armor he was clad in. The man's lower body was a scorpion, and the transition from man to scorpion was seamless. Han Sen looked at the scorpion man, feeling his life force to be even greater than disloyal knights. Why would this guy's shadow be a super creature? Han Sen wondered as he looked at the scorpion man. The scorpion man then waved his tail and plunged it into the chest of the corpse on the ground. Then, the body quickly became slimmer. The man's body returned to normal as all the stinging fluids went into the tail of the scorpion man. Then, after that, the man stood up. He looked very energized. When the man stood up, he walked towards the scorpion man angrily. When he was in front of the scorpion man became that man's shadow. The man fell to the ground, throwing his fists against his own shadow. It looked like he was just punching the sand. The man's hands bled as they beat against the ground, but he did not seem as if he wanted to stop. Little Yin. Uncle Bug ran towards the man, wanting to hug him. When the man turned around, though, Uncle Bug stopped his approach. I will hate you forever. The man looked furious. The man stood up, picked up a rock, and tried to slam it into his own head. But before he could do that, a shadow touched the rock, causing it to explode. He couldn't kill himself. The man tried his hardest to kill himself, repeatedly, but each and every time, the shadow stopped him. Uncle Bug was crying again, with a face that was full of regret and pain. The man had been savagely injured, but he couldn't be free and allow himself to die. Little Yin, stop this. Uncle Bug guiltily pleaded. What did you expect? Is this what you wanted me to become? The man angrily responded. In continued tears, Uncle Bug exclaimed, I didn't want to, but you were sick. It said it would fix you. I didn't expect. Uncle Bug's tears did not relent. He fixed me, and I am not dead. The man was laughing, but it was a laughter of hysteria. This was worse than him crying. I am sorry, Uncle Bug said. The man, who was laughing like a madman, responded, You are not. You made me suffer something that was worse than being killed. Uncle Bug grabbed his own hair, all the while crying. If I knew this was going to happen, I wouldn't have. Uncle Bug's dialogue disintegrated into incoherent mumbling and babbling. The man looked at Uncle Bug, saying, This is my life. His words were coaxed with desperation and sadness. After a while, the sun began to rise. And as it did, the man said, If you continue to believe I am your son, find someone to kill me. I would rather be dead. Little Yin. Uncle Bug looked at the man in profound sadness, but as he did, the man fell to the ground. Han Sen was surprised at the sudden turn of events. He was still alive, just unconscious. Uncle Bug used a bag to pick the man up and then turned to leave the area. If Han Sen described what had happened to someone who hadn't seen it with their own eyes, they'd think he was off his rocker. Han Sen quickly followed after Uncle Bug to see where he was off to. Han Sen thought it might have something to do with the god that Sunset had mentioned. Perhaps by following, he could learn more and uncover the mystery at long last. Uncle Bug took the man back through the forest to Nest Shelter, though. Then, he took the man to his room. Han Sen waited outside the room. It wasn't until the next day that Uncle Bug emerged, acting as if nothing had occurred. He issued commands and went back to his usual duties, telling others to hunt and so on. Uncle Bug, there is something I need to ask you. Privately, if I may, Han Sen asked Uncle Bug. There is no need for privacy. Just tell me here, and I'll help you out. Uncle Bug smiled, acting his usual self. But Han Sen then implored, I really must speak to you alone about this. Uncle Bug sighed and took Han Sen to a place outside the shelter. Little Han, tell me what's the matter. If it is within my capacity to help, I will, Uncle Bug said as he lit up a cigarette. Do you know anything about the Secret Service's 7th team?
Han Sen asked.
Uncle Bug casually shook his head, asking, What is that? Do you know Han Jinji? Han Sen then asked. Uncle Bug responded, Your great-grandfather is Han Jinji. He must be a great man if you keep mentioning him. Han Sen then said, Then you must know Sunset. Uncle Bug looked at Han Sen strangely, clearly not expecting such a response. He told him, I must be getting too old. I don't remember a person called Sunset. Then you must know Little Yin, Han Sen said. Uncle Bug's body shivered. He stiffened himself up, telling Han Sen, I haven't heard of anyone going by these names. You forgot what you wished for?
Han Sen sighed mockingly.
After that, Uncle Bug's composure changed. He suddenly looked like an angry lion, and he exclaimed, Who are you? Han Sen could feel Uncle Bug's life force, and he could tell the man was the greatest and most powerful surpasser he had ever known. Surpassers these days never came close to the heights of Uncle Bug. At his age, it was a surprise to see him have such a high fitness. Humans did not max out their genes back when Uncle Bug had been in his prime, so it was quite the surprise to see how powerful the old man had become. Do you really not know who I am? I told you the name of my great-grandfather.
Han Sen looked at Uncle Bug.
That is impossible. He cannot have had an heir, Uncle Bug said. Why not? Everyone can make babies, Han Sen casually responded. But he, Uncle Bug suddenly stopped. His rage returned before he spoke again, and he blurted out, How dare you try and trick me? I asked you a question first. Who are you? If you don't tell me, you'll have to excuse my ruthless actions. Seeing Uncle Bug's murderous look, Han Sen could now see how cruel of a person he must have really been. Han Sen sighed, unsure whether or not he'd be able to pluck more information from him. Thinking this, he decided to tell him, Uncle Bug, I was in that valley the other night. Uncle Bug's grimace turned to visible shock as he stared at Han Sen. That was your son, wasn't it? I think I can help. This was Han Sen's one and only trump card. If he wanted the information he sought, this was the only way. Uncle Bug still looked to be fuming with anger, but he asked, How do you know Sunset? I met her. Han Sen proceeded to tell Uncle Bug about his encounter with her, inside the crystallizer ruins. Uncle Bug, after hearing what he was told, had a complex look fall across his face. He said, She still decided on living forever young. So, were you really a member of the 7th team? What happened?
Han Sen asked.
Uncle Bug said, It is none of your business. If you pursue this matter any further, it'll only lead to ruin. Don't get yourself killed over all this. If that is so, do you need me to remind you about your son? Do you want him to remain in such a condition? I can help him. Han Sen knew the man would still be a little too stubborn to elucidate. Uncle Bug shook his head, saying, Just go, and don't breathe a word about this to anyone else. If you do, you're dead. Han Sen didn't move, though. He remained and told Uncle Bug, You are very strong, but even you cannot deal with the creature in the shadow. No one can deal with it, Uncle Bug said with a wry smile. I can, Han Sen said. Han Sen knew it was a powerful super creature, but he still believed he could defeat it with the aid of disloyal night. The only thing Han Sen did not know was the relationship between the man and the creature. He had to learn more about that. With another wry smile, Uncle Bug said, "You have no idea what that thing is. It is only a super creature. It is not some elaborate secret," Han Sen dourly said. Uncle Bug responded, "No single human can beat super creatures in the third god sanctuary." "I'm not just anyone," Han Sen said. Uncle Bug wished to say something more, but suddenly, Han Sen's back was blazing with a bright fire. Wings were outstretched, transforming him into a big fiery bird. "Is that a super shape-shifting beast soul?" Uncle Bug gasped with surprise. Han Sen returned to his human form and said, "So, what do you think? Do I have what it takes?" Uncle Bug looked at Han Sen and said, "You are special. I'll give you that. But shape-shifting beast souls can be draining, and you don't have an infinite amount of time to use it. Well, what about with this guy by my side?"
Han Sen summoned disloyal night.
A super pet beast soul with battle mode? Uncle Bug was incredibly shocked by this. "Even if I was unable to defeat the creature, I could bring your son everlasting peace," Han Sen said, peering into Uncle Bug's emotional reaction. Uncle Bug bore a complicated look, one that was a mixture of excitement and confusion. His lips trembled when he asked, "What do you want from me?" "I want to know what transpired in that other dimension, the one spoken of by Sunset. And I want to know why everyone keeps saying Han Jinji could not have had an heir." Han Sen gave his terms. To this, Uncle Bug said, "If you can help little Yin, I will tell you everything. Then it is settled. But it would be best if you tell me what happened to your son first, and tell me exactly what I'm dealing with here. I will do my best to kill the creature without harming your son, if such a thing is possible," Han Sen kindly said. Uncle Bug looked touched upon hearing this, and he said, "Little Yan's mother bore the same sickness. He has what she had. There was no cure, and his mother passed away. The same fate was to soon befall little Yan." Uncle Bug told him most of the story. Han Sen was able to fill in the blank spots himself. Uncle Bug said that he had learned of a way in which he could save his son. It was a method in which you could sign a contract and bind your life to that of a creature. They could live together, sharing energy. Uncle Bug convinced his son to sign such a contract, and his son did indeed live. But unfortunately, his son was too weak to share his life with the creature, and now he was being entirely controlled by it. Little Yin was in a vegetative state, only waking up once a month. What Han Sen had witnessed was him traveling to the valley to absorb scorpion poison and feed the super creature that lived inside him. If Uncle Bug did not take him to the valley, he'd be in even more agony than that which he suffered at the stings of the scorpions. His fate truly was worse than death. Although he had avoided death, he was most certainly not living. He was hardly human, and he had suffered this fate for 100 years. Han Sen felt a shiver run down his spine when he imagined what it must have felt like to exist in such a state. Han Sen had never heard of such a method being employed before, though, and he believed it might have had some connection to the seventh team accessing the dimension that Sunset had told him about. He had been able to come to the third god's sanctuary and sign a contract with a super creature. No ordinary human could do such a thing, not through ordinary means. But these were just guesses and thoughts Han Sen had, and he wasn't sure if they were correct. Qin Huaizhen, Sunset, and Uncle Bug all claimed to have seen a figure that proclaimed itself to be God in that dimension. Perhaps that God was a being that said it could fulfill their wishes. Qin Huaizhen may have wished to live forever, so he was frozen in place. But still that only led to death and did not make him immortal. Perhaps Sunset wanted to be young forever, so she was placed inside that vase to remain like so. When she was exposed to the elements outside that sturdy vase, that age caught up with her and she died. Uncle Bug's wish may not have applied to himself. It could have been to save his son, but even those results turned sour. If Han Sen's hypothesis was correct, and that really was God, Han Sen thought he was an asterisk shoal. "Don't worry, I'll do my best to take down that super creature," Han Sen said. Killing the super creature he had proposed to slay would not be easy. Uncle Bug told him the shadow of the creature was what possessed his son, but the actual body he would have to defeat was someplace in the valley. Han Sen thought about the bugs he had thrown down into the valley, the ones that disappeared, and wondered whether or not they were related to the creature he was preparing to defeat. Han Sen returned to the valley, bringing many bugs with him. He perched himself atop the hill like he had before and tossed a few bugs down into the valley every now and again. Just like before, the bugs would try to scurry away but then get snatched by some unseen force. They just vanish into thin air. Han Sen kept chucking the bugs into the same spot and noticed the bugs only disappeared when they reached a certain point. That proved there were no space cracks, as space cracks could not move. If there are no space cracks, then that means it must be a super creature. But if so, how can it make these bugs disappear so easily? Han Sen thought hard about what may have been the crux of the issue. Whatever was going on, his Dongxian aura was not able to detect any creatures down there. Being unable to determine the nature of the threat made Han Sen far more cautious than usual. Han Sen remained on the hill for a few days, watching and waiting to see what he could. If there was a creature lurking beneath the sands, he wanted to see it. Han Sen watched the shadows of the bugs intently, wanting to see if there were any disruption before they disappeared. It was a fine idea, but did not provide him the answers he sought. Nothing was assaulting the bugs from within their own shadows. In the midst of all these uncertainties, one thing was for sure. It was a scary super creature, and Han Sen had yet to gauge how powerful it might have been. A lack of intel was one of the most dangerous things when attempting to fight a foe. But whatever the case may have been, it looked to Han Sen that there were two possibilities. First, the creature itself was invisible. Or second, the powers of the super creature were invisible. If it's the second possibility, I should have no problems dealing with it. If it's the first possibility, I'll need to watch myself. That'd be tough, Han Sen thought to himself. If it was a creature that the Dongxian aura could not even detect, it had to be an absurdly powerful monster. Due to Han Sen's desire for caution, he remained there for another 15 days. Unfortunately, despite all the time that had elapsed, he still had zero concrete intel on the creature he would have to face. If he didn't want the secret of Han Jinji and 7th Team, he wouldn't even think about fighting such a creature. You only live once. Every strike could be fatal, so Han Sen needed to know he could get a handle on whatever he would face when he confronted the creature. And Han Sen really wanted to know what had happened with the 7th Team and why Han Jinji humiliated God as Sunset had told him. And also, why Qin Huaizhen had told him to be wary of Han Jinji. Han Sen had been collecting breadcrumbs for this entire affair for a long time, and he was desperate for the full story. The knowledge was within his reach, so he had to commit to what he had pledged to do for Uncle Bug. If he did this, he would finally know everything he wished to. That night, Han Sen heard a baby crying once more. Uncle Bug said he had to bring his son there once a month, so it wasn't time yet. This made Han Sen a little wary, and he wondered why there'd be movement now. The human-faced scorpions came out, covering every inch of that valley in their thick and wriggling hides. It was disgusting. If there were space cracks there, scorpions would have slipped in, no doubt. This frightening sight certainly put that theory to bed. Their movement drew Han Sen's attention, and he watched intently as they all began to congregate in the center of the Y-shaped valley. A curious view, as there did not appear to be anything of particular interest in that spot. Eventually, their congregation began to spread and form a circle. They left the very center spot open. Han Sen stared at the space they had left open and noticed something. The moonlight was extra bright on this night, due to it being a full moon. The moonlight began to illuminate the oily hides of the scorpions, making the faces on their backs seem alive. When the light hit the spot they had left open, it was as if the light was striking an invisible wall. It seemed to collect and form a faint outline. Han Sen's eyes opened wide, as more and more light gathered to form a faint figure. Eventually, Han Sen was able to see the shape of a half-man, half-scorpion creature that was identical to the one that plagued Uncle Bug's son. But whereas the shadow variant he had seen with Uncle Bug's son was pitch black, this one was transparent. If it wasn't for the moonlight illuminating it, Han Sen didn't think he'd have been able to see it at all. But even though Han Sen could see it with his naked eyes, the Dongxian aura still proved ineffective. He still couldn't get a feel for the life force of the scorpion. The fact that the transparent scorpion seemed to be capable of eluding the Dongxian aura was a frightening thing to think about. This guy is invisible.
Han Sen frov ned.
This was the worst possible result he could have. Maybe it would be best for me to strike now, while I can still see it. Han Sen stared at it, thinking of how he'd begin his engagement with the beast. But eventually, Han Sen decided against fighting it. He remained there, watching the invisible scorpion, absorbing the moonlight that had been channeled through the bright reflections of the little scorpion's chitin. This went on for 1 hour, and when the moon began its descent, the reflections subsided. And then, the faint outline of the scorpion man-beast went with it.